Hi, I'm Vinay Koshy, and you're listening to Predictable B2B Success podcast, which is brought to you by sproutwith.com. I have a question. Can integrating mission driven strategies not only enhance your company's social impact, but also drive predictable revenue growth and competitive differentiation, especially in the B2B technology sector? If so, how? To seek answers, I'll be speaking with our guest, Paul Burani. Paul, you've got more than 20 years of experience in sales and marketing leadership roles. In fact, you've dedicated most of your career to social impact causes such as workforce development, economic development, diversity, equality and inclusion, and innovation in education. I believe you got started in the media and advertising space back in 2007 when you founded a digital agency and then guided it to acquisition. Spent 6 years at Google in various sales positions, including founding the first industry development team to support Google's global automotive business, and then transitioned into the edtech space, working with companies like Udacity, Catalyte, and Tech Elevator, and more recently, of course, starting Mission Flywheel, where you're applying many of the lessons you've learned through your experiences to help founders of early stage companies inspire confidence in their customers and investors. I'm curious, Paul, given your journey to date, was there a pivotal moment that brought you to the realization of the need to start Mission Flywheel? If so, what was it?
That's a good question, and I appreciate the intro. It sounds like you know me better than I know myself, Vinay. Uh, but thank you. I think it's really for me a series of small moments, and I think that different people respond to their inspiration in different ways. But in my case, the idea of setting up my own shop to support companies as they look to merge their more classic and traditional revenue strategy with something that also generates social impact really was like I said, a series of small realizations that this is possible, that there is a market for it, and that my work was organically bringing me closer and closer to that mission anyway.
Mhm.
So in a sense, I spent a number of years auditioning and learning the skills, working with big brands, making huge investments to measure things happening in the world around them. And I mean, it's very inspiring to watch, for example, big global auto brands, how they meticulously look at consumer behavior, look at their own evolution and their sort of technology transformation. I picked up a trick or two just from observing all of that. And so that was one moment. But there have been moments along the way where I also realized there was a part of me that didn't die when I traded my entrepreneurial business card for the job at Google and ultimately going into a more traditional corporate environment. I think there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who just have it in their blood. I may or may not have it in my blood, but I certainly am enjoying revisiting this and feeling like I can be my best self, bring my best ideas to the table to join the cause.
I'm sure a lot of listeners will be going social impact and business. I'm not too sure about the correlation between the two. It's nice to have, but I'm curious, given your experiences and observations, uh, how would you communicators kind of sitting on the fence or unsure about uh, bringing in social impact into the overall strategy and operations of the business?
I would say I agree. It is nice to have. And let's talk about how you can have it, right? I think any business really could be a social enterprise, starting with how they take care of their people. So if you are merely setting an example, merely, I mean, this is a high standard to live up to, but to just be a workplace that is a good place for talent to develop, where people are treated justly, where perhaps you can break some conventions around lack of equity in pay across different minority or underrepresented groups. That alone is a way, no matter what you sell, if you sell widgets that do absolutely no good for society, but just hire good people, reward good people for being good people, there's a lot right there. But failing that, if you need something more substantial to paint a picture, there are just a lot of industries now that are in a state of rapid transformation. You could argue every industry is evolving faster than perhaps ever before. And that comes from the pace of technological innovation, the pace of social change, just the pace of information that flows to every corner of the earth every day, many times over. And I think that solving big problems that hold us back, ultimately, that's what companies do in order to raise revenue. Whatever product you sell, you're solving a problem. But as we become more aware of pressing problems in society, the onset of climate change, the lack of equity in certain corners of certain communities within any country or within the global society, there's a lot that needs to be fixed. And so I think I would argue that virtually any industry could approach this in some way to look at the greater good and say we can drive our profits, we can increase shareholder value, we can make everybody at this company a success while also solving something bigger than just us.
I'd love to dive into that in a bit, but I'm also curious, given your journey to date, what would you say would be your personal area of strength?
It's always interesting to try and narrow down to one thing as a singular area of strength. I was always taught growing up that the best thing you can do is be well-rounded, right? And so that means that there are hopefully many strengths, equally many weaknesses. I think one thing that I certainly enjoy and have had success with is storytelling in a business environment, applying some of the principles that make us persuasive and make us effective in communication when we are being our truest selves, and bringing them into the workplace to convey big ideas of strategic importance, to put people at ease when they're making big investments. Power of story is such a fascinating thing. I think I'm good at it. I also think I have a lot to learn because all of us could be always a whole lot better than they are.
Yeah, very interesting. In that area of strength, what would you say is something that businesses don't know but should?
Businesses, just across the
Yep.
board,
Yep.
businesses don't
About
know.
storytelling.
I will answer in with a specific lens, and I would say don't know or perhaps know, but lose sight of the importance of making emotional connections with customers.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of us could say there's a certain
Mhm.
intuition, or even there's research that shows people buy for emotional reasons, not for pragmatic or rational or logical reasons. Whether you're selling a timeshare vacation or ball bearings to a factory, I think that companies lose sight of this because we're so awash in data and we are so enthused about our ability to tell stories with data that we also forget sometimes about the need to tell a different kind of
Mhm.
story. Put that purchasing agent in a protagonist role and show them what it means to their career to identify a partner that's so unique. I think there's an aspect of this which gets lost in the shuffle of just a quarterly cycle of reporting on earnings and all of that good stuff.
And given this idea of creating social impact and storytelling as well, would you say that perhaps most companies should hire the right C level executives earlier than they typically do? If so, what advantages does this bring, especially in the startup environment?
I'll make a generalization here, Vinay. I think that probably a lot of founders would like to
Mhm.
build top because it stands to reason, right? You want the architects of the company and the stewards of that evolution to be experienced, to have institutional knowledge, relationships, whatever it might be. Common sense might dictate that from a cash flow perspective or from an investor optics perspective, it makes more sense to hire some individual contributors and put people out in the field, whatever it might be. I think that the really optimistic thing is that labor models are starting to really flex. And we're seeing a greater openness to working with maybe just non traditional models of sourcing and of onboarding and retaining talent. So, one example of this would be a real movement that we've seen towards fractional
Mhm.
executives. In this instance, it's quite simple on paper, right? You're basically saying, here's a very senior person who you may not be able to afford until 18 months from now if you brought them on 5 days a week, full time, bonus structure, equity package, all of that. And the reality is, having that person today and not 18 months from now, it would be awfully useful to a company that needs this individual's guidance, whatever representation whatever contribution to the business, their CFO, their head of people, chief revenue
Mhm.
officer, whatever it might be. So I think that it's good news, the ability to say, hey, our founding team consists of the following people with the following abilities. And across the proverbial C suite, we're halfway covered. This is great.
Mhm.
Instead of putting on other hats and moonlighting as something we're not, we're going to focus on what we do best. And we're going to bring in fractional talent to man the ship, to establish some sort of presence. And even if it's 1 or 2 days a week, this person is setting the table for a future business, several rounds of funding into the future, where we now have the ability to bring someone on and to attract them with the type of salary that it takes to get good people. So I love what I'm seeing with the fractional movement right now. And I think that in part, we owe some of it to the pandemic, because the pandemic really taught humanity
Mhm.
very quickly a couple of lessons around work across every culture, across every country. As long as you had an internet connection, you could, with some changes to your MO, you could be effective and be productive. And in some cases, even more than you were. So we've taught ourselves now that we are, in fact, more flexible than we realized. And so now there's this secondary wave of all these interesting experimentations. And I think it's a fascinating world we're living in right now, because there's disruption in labor
Mhm.
markets, but there's also a lot of solutions.
It's an interesting idea, this idea of bringing on fractional executives. I would assume that in most people's minds, especially if they haven't dabbled in this area of bringing on fractional executives, that the closest thing that would come to mind would be, say, it would be akin to bringing on freelancers to deal with a particular project. Is that the same mentality that is required in working with fractional executives, especially when the work that founders would be expecting could be fairly significant in terms of laying the right foundations in certain teams or departments?
Yeah, there's, to a limited degree, there are similarities just in terms of a strategic decision that's made for the role not to be full time or not to be indefinite in its duration. But really, the similarities end there. The truth is, fractional in its purest sense implies leadership level
Mhm.
responsibility. So you are CXO, you are chief of something, which means typically you're reporting to the CEO. You might have even some visibility at a board level. You have relationships with the rest of the C suite, talking about how the different functions of the business are coming
Mhm.
together. You are accountable to people under you or adjacent to you that contribute to your department, and the buck stops with you. And maybe you'll get an email about a crisis that's not on your 1 or 2 days a week that you're working. Those are the details that get sorted out later. But I think the important thing is accountability and responsibility is a lot higher level than a freelancer who typically comes in
Mhm.
specialized in something, prepared to make a measurable contribution in something, but generally in a finite capacity.
Okay, so the goalposts, as it were, or the metrics would be a lot more different than, say, managing purely by objective. Would that be a fair comment?
I think there might be some cultural differences in the definition of management by objective. The way that I'm traditionally familiar with that term is when you set performance metrics that are not directly linked to revenue.
Mhm.
And so you might be looking at throughput of sales opportunities. I'm coming from the sales world, and so I think of it in terms of some of the custom KPIs that people spin up. So is that the same management by objective that you're referring to?
That could be the case, but at the C suite, there would also be revenue objectives, I would assume, that need to be hit.
Sure. Yeah. And ultimately, I think corporations are moving in the direction where every department
Mhm.
is going to be measured that way, and every fragment of every department is going to have some version of that. Google didn't invent the OKR framework, but was one of the places that really made it
Mm.
famous. And I will say it was rolled out pretty thoroughly and effectively, and it was really a very good feeling to sit in a leadership all hands and listen to the global head of some department at Google grading themselves transparently in front of the whole company and saying, this is what we committed to 3 months ago, and here's how we did, and red, yellow, green to indicate how well you achieved those goals. One thing that I really appreciate about the culture that we had at Google was that there was an unwritten rule that if you had too much green on your OKR scorecard, then actually your hand might get slapped because it probably meant you weren't setting ambitious enough goals. And so if you zoom out and you really think about the implications of that, it's a very comforting feeling to say, hey, this is an organization that's going to allow us to fail forward, whatever level we're at. And so I think that that's obviously a catalyst to organizational shifts that we're seeing. But generally speaking, more and more things can be measured now. We've got a whole cottage industry of business intelligence and analytics providers out there that are making it real interesting for us. I think it's all going that way.
Mm.
And the quicker departments and leaders get on board, the better off everyone will be.
Certainly. I'm also curious, what would you say are some common misconceptions about the right time to hire sales leaders in a growing business?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think that, look, it's a very, because sales is so objective in its measurement, not only is there a very clear metric revenue that is associated with it and can really be a referendum on the performance of the team or the individual at any given time. I think that it's also very clear what these teams are here to do. So there's a very easy metric to measure them, and there isn't any other noise. It's very objective. Because of that, I think these are looked. The expansion of a sales team is looked a little bit more like commodity trading than perhaps really thoughtful, strategic investing.
Mhm.
And by that I mean that there's a tendency to say, if we're going to want this much revenue, we have to give ourselves this much runway. We need this many people to come in and to ramp this quickly and to achieve this quota. So you can see everything is very objective. And because of that, I think there's a tendency to say, hey, let's go as long as we possibly can without adding more salespeople.
Mhm.
Let's start with the co-founders doing deals. Even if we're technical people that don't know how to talk to clients, we're the ones out there talking to clients. And then maybe there's there might be like outsourced business development support, maybe a couple of well-connected individuals connected through accelerators or through the board introductions that are made. So and so is really connected in the industry. This person's willing to make qualified introductions, and that's a way to
Mm.
grow. And then you get to a point where you can start hiring a team. But it's very much there. There aren't too many leading indicators in favor of it. And so I think what the misconception is: don't invest ahead of the curve. Only invest for what you need today. Don't give yourself a whole lot of cartilage because you're not going to have that luxury.
Mm.
This has also been driven home by a lot of the fortunes, the ups and downs of the tech industry in the last 2 years or so. Basically, all of them, when they were laying off 5,000, 8,000, 15,000 people at a time, were saying every time the reason was the same: we overhired during the pandemic. And a lot of that was sales and sales support functions. So now everybody in every industry is thinking, we don't want to be that because Wall Street's going to hit us even harder
Mm.
for repeating the sins of what we saw years ago. For all these reasons, I think people are afraid to invest ahead of the curve. And I think that it's just a question of where are your priorities as a growing organization?
Interesting. Can you describe a time when you had to perhaps help a client shift their business mindset? What were the challenges you faced and what were the outcomes?
Yeah, I think this is something that, to some degree, I've dealt with throughout my career. At Google, in the automotive business, the when you think like 10 years ago,
Mm.
give or take, the business was very focused on direct marketing. So automakers would partner with Google to just make sure that every search, every relevant click was in some way associated with behavior that would ultimately manifest at the point of sale. Relatively little was spent telling people this is why the shift to electric vehicles is important, or this is Genesis, the new luxury brand that's part of Hyundai Motor Corp. It was a lot more around you're in the Los Angeles area and just queried a 3-row SUV. Here are some ways that you can get to a dealer and buy one quickly.
Hmm.
And so if you think about that journey from the very top to the very bottom, you're looking at sometimes it's 2 or 3 months, a lot of times it's 6 months or more. And Google was really playing down here with our advertiser partners and changing their mindset and getting them to think like brand marketers was always what Google was aspiring
Hmm.
to. And so YouTube and other investments adjacent to google.com were becoming an outsized priority. We're going to work this much harder knowing that we're going to bring in less revenue necessarily than if we were to just invest in more search coverage. But actually, we fought fire with fire in looking for growth in at a global level in 2016 when that collective business was worth $1 billion to Google. Where do you go for growth? You can try to go up the funnel and convince an industry that is not known for long-term brand development, get them to think differently about their brands. We tried that and we were going to keep trying, but actually it was lower in the funnel where there was still so much value. And that value came from working with the retail channels directly. So the dealerships who have no legal affiliation with the manufacturer, and in many cases, really at odds with the manufacturer, but bridging those two, getting them to share more intelligence, more data, and ultimately being connective tissue between brand and retail, doing this globally was a beautiful thing
Hmm.
because it really showed that there was still a lot of white space for us to color in. And you would have a BMW pilot spring up in Argentina where all of the dealers were going to be supported just to switch the lights on with these advertising programs. And then it's Mercedes Benz in New Zealand, and then it's Volkswagen in the United Arab Emirates, and pretty soon things are happening. So it was a very interesting way to double down on what always worked, but to pivot and think differently about who to go to for progress. That really challenged a lot of thinking internal to Google as well as in the automotive industry.
That's a fascinating example you shared there. And bring this back to what you're doing now with the Mission Flywheel. How do you establish rapport and credibility with new clients, especially those who are skeptical about early C-level hires?
I think the trick for that, Vinay, is not to cast myself as a C-level hire
Well,
from the start. And I think anybody who you reach a certain point in your career where you can have a dialogue at a certain
mhm.
level, you stop auditioning as much as perhaps when you're earlier in your career and you're thinking, okay, I have to hop from one to the next and I have to be thoughtful and interview and network and all that. That all still happens. But I think it also, there's a gray area where you build rapport by being helpful, by being an active listener, hearing out what are the concerns that are keeping this person in this company from achieving what they want, and finding a fit
Mhm.
and figuring out what is a way that I could be helpful to them. Starting with anecdotes, right? I've seen a challenge similar to this before. Or have you considered this type of approach to solving something that you're struggling to solve? I think just being an advisor, and I do a lot of mentorship and accelerators because I enjoy it and because for anybody who likes to get their hands dirty problem solving,
Mm.
it's a steady flow, it's constant snacking. It's great. I think that you build rapport by applying your knowledge and giving.
Mhm.
You give enough. You don't need to ask for the right to provide a proposal or pitch a product. If you give enough, it becomes a dialogue that inevitably arms you with all kinds of insight. And then you're not selling, you're just making it very evident where the fit is.
Hmm. Would you say that running a podcast, for instance, not just for um, external purposes, but even within an organization, would be a good way to bring to the fore expertise, knowledge, insights that would not otherwise necessarily be communicated once you're 50 plus people within an organization?
I think I relate to podcasters. If I had a little more initiative, I would do what you're doing, Vinay. But thankfully, there are people like you to give people like me some exposure. When I was in college, I had a radio show, Graveyard Shift,
Hmm.
3 to 6 a.m. And I enjoyed it very much. And when I listen to podcasts that I love or watch podcasts that I love, I'm always brought back to that time. It's all about format. We have the same ideas in our head that we might bring to the keyboard when we type an email. We bring them to a meeting when we meet a client, and they're going through your head when you try to fall asleep at night. The podcast is just a different channel where it takes a slightly different shape. This is the kind of dialogue that I don't necessarily have on Slack
Hmm.
for obvious reasons, or email, or any other channel. And so I think that people that are self-starters, that enjoy meeting other people and asking probing questions to get real kind of substance in the answers, I could see the value of that
Mhm.
enduring as a business owner starts to build something meaningful.
I'm curious how you do it in terms of giving value, because for most people, structure and managing attention is key. How do you, for example, provide that value in the course of your day or week?
I agree with you. People's attention is
Mhm.
finite, and I think that especially in the last half generation, we've realized that our attention is just so marketable. It's constantly under
Mhm.
siege, and we have to protect it. I think the most important thing is to recognize that in other people and say, "Hey, look, you're giving me 15 minutes of your time. You're giving me a half hour. I'm going to make it worth it, right?
Mhm.
I'm gonna have an agenda. I'm going to have a couple of insights that I've prepared. We're going to talk a little bit and really understand like what motivates each other. It it's a gesture of respect to make the most of somebody's time, and so I think that it's just important to show that humility with somebody, especially if you're meeting them for the first time.
Mhm.
And generally, those good deeds are, I think, noticed and appreciated.
Brilliant. In terms of mission driven strategies, in what ways can being mission driven be a competitive advantage in the B2B technology marketplace? I wonder if you could explain with an example.
Yeah, I think that there are a number of ways because, first of all, at the highest level, there are really movements to recognize companies
Mhm.
that are operating with more of a sort of pro social orientation. And so you have an ESG strategy, you have a CSR program, you register as a B Corp. These are ways that you can really cast the nature of your mission driven organization, the true essence of it, for competitive
Mhm.
advantage. But I think at the ground level, there's a whole other aspect, which is just conscious consumerism, which is, I think it's still a behavior that's maybe a little bit of an edge case
Mhm.
in global society, but that's changing rapidly. And people are making a statement by the products they buy, the brands that they support, and the companies they choose to do business with. And so I think there are many examples out there. Basically, you could come up with examples for every industry. I think a classic one is Tom's, the shoe
Mhm.
manufacturer, right? They pioneered a model which has now been borrowed by other sectors, which is basically to say, hey, every time you buy one of our products, we're going to take it right out of our margin to give one away because the same shoes that make your feet happy
Mhm.
are going to change someone's life because it'll be their first pair of shoes. So that story is incredibly valuable, and they were smart enough to catch on that you could build a lot of brand equity and earned media and just goodwill and affinity simply by practicing this sort of act of kindness. Was there a nefarious PR stunt underlying all of it? Probably to some degree. Somebody was saying, I can squeeze this for all it's worth. But you have to look at it on balance that it's actually doing a lot of good.
Mhm. Certainly. Have you seen a similar example in the B2B space?
Yeah, in the B2B space, it's interesting because I think that your relationships are not as much out in the open.
Mhm.
So I, as a consumer of Tom's, would be that's a very different statement than what my company chooses to buy for a CRM solution. And so I think what it comes down to is more just it's less of the vanity play, and it's more of the we connect with each other on the problems we're trying to solve. And I think you think of examples, there are a lot of manufacturers of products who choose to do business with suppliers that are minority owned, or you'll see they'll provide some sort of incentives to companies that are 100% owned and operated by immigrants, for example. And so, to be honest, I think you could find those examples anywhere.
Mhm. And as we're looking to incorporate mission driven strategies, what would you say should be the first steps a technology company, for example, should take to integrate these strategies into their business operations?
I think the technology can be defined very
Mhm.
broadly, right? And so if it's a technology for disseminating short form video to every corner of the earth, that's very different than a technology to measure carbon emissions in some novel, innovative way. The product you sell can solve social problems, and therefore could be crafted into a broader mission orientation. But a lot of companies have missions that are more inward looking and say we want to be a good employer, we want to be a place where good people get by, we're a meritocracy, we give people ample space to be themselves. Those are equally meaningful. It comes down to, can you make a credible statement that you're an agent of change in solving a particular social problem?
Mhm.
And if your product doesn't, you can still solve certain problems by just being a good corporate citizen.
Mhm. So, when it comes to attracting investors with a social mission, how does having a social mission influence investor interest and funding opportunities, especially, say, in the tech space?
The main way in which it fits into
Mhm.
that picture is simply because there is a growing surge of funding going into impact driven investments. And so you'll find VC firms all over the world starting to spring up, private equity. You'll see angel investors with a specific orientation. You'll see venture studios that find their participants, accelerators, they find their participants by some specific orientation towards social impact. To give you an example, Techstars is an organization that I volunteer with that they do cohorts all over the world.
Mhm.
They're the world's largest pre-seed investor. My first Techstars event was actually a cohort. It was demo day for a cohort of 12 companies that were part of the economic mobility initiative supported by a number of VCs. And it was, you can start to see there's some shared DNA across all of these founders. So I think that impact investment is just a wave that social entrepreneurs should be riding. Odds are they became social entrepreneurs because, in part, they see that the world is waking up and starting to invest more in these social enterprises.
Mhm.
But I think that it also comes down to appealing to every individual investor and their desire to do some kind of good with their money.
Mhm.
We're surrounded by people that visibly are motivated by money, but there's a lot of research into real human nature underlying all of that, that we actually thrive more on impact and on progress. And we feel better about ourselves when we see that what we do matters versus when we just get a slightly bigger paycheck.
Mhm.
So I think you can use that logic with investors too. They're in that meeting, they're having that conversation because they expect a return. But if you can pull them in with a story, going back to my point about storytelling
Mhm.
in these unique contexts, if you can make it more emotive, I think there's a lot to be gained.
In a similar vein, will it also apply to attracting and retaining customers differently than, say, traditional methods?
I think the jury's still out because, to be honest, this is still relatively new
Mhm.
when we think about companies that distance themselves from the pack, either from the rest of their competition or from the whole industry, from all businesses in general. Some of these companies, I think, are going to find that it becomes there might be some pressure from the board when earnings don't come in the way they're expected, and so you can say get rid of some of the fluff, get rid of the ESG programs, right? Those are becoming very politicized, and you can see that the pendulum is swinging. When you look at customer retention, in depending on the business, you could be talking about a 2-year relationship, a 5-year relationship. It could be they're not always going to churn very quickly the way they do in B2C. I think we have to see as more and more of these purpose-driven enterprises spring up,
Hmm.
are they able to retain customers purely by showing them, look at the impact we're making together. It might happen that there's a shakeout where in this inflationary environment, the contracts go to the lowest bidders, and maybe some of this doesn't see the light of day. But I think that over time, it comes back to people's motivations, and that being part of a resolution to bigger problems, especially as they start to affect us as people, is going to be the winning strategy.
Very interesting. What would you say are some of the other bigger challenges that companies face when shifting to a mission driven business model?
I'm not sure that it's the sort of shift that happens very
Mhm.
quickly. I think that most likely it's more like steering the Titanic, right? You're talking about small changes that manifest over a long period of time. Sure, there's a better analogy I could have come up with than steering the Titanic, because this is a positive story about making these small changes to actually affect change and really just improve the profile of this corporation. But I think that if we just consider over time that investments in social impact will bring more exposure, will bring more association with solutions to big problems that we can no longer deny. When we start to find that climate change is undeniable, or we start to find that we just have such deep rooted problems in society, in education, in healthcare, in energy, that it's very clear who's working towards a solution, that over time this will be a common sense decision rather than an evolutionary shift. And as that happens, it's just going to happen hire by hire. Are we bringing in people that understand what we're here to do versus the way we used to hire people in the past?
And as companies scale, how would you suggest that they ensure that their mission remains integral to that growth journey?
I think really this is the responsibility of the leadership team
Mhm.
and the board to really take the initiative to think about this, not just in the present, but also in the future. In theory, that's what those individuals are really accountable
Mhm.
to, is steering the company. I think that as you grow, there's when new blood comes in, it's absolutely essential to have thoughtful, not only hiring processes, but onboarding processes and retention and employee mobility, right? Because if you
Mhm.
allow people to grow with your company, they will understand what you're about. Versus if you're the kind of environment where people are pitted against one another more, and not you can't find as many people getting by or more than getting by, then the mission becomes secondary because people are just out for themselves.
Mhm.
So if you can hold on to that sense of community in a company, always make people feel like it's a meritocracy. Tall order. I understand that it's very easy to say it. It's a lot harder to actually do it. But I think that's how you keep that mission intact.
Mhm. And in your experience, would you say that there are certain qualities that you believe are essential for leaders in mission driven companies?
Yes, endless list of qualities. I think what comes to mind is self awareness,
Hmm.
the ability to say that we as individuals, or we as a collective of individuals that are a corporation, are not infallible.
Mhm.
And in fact, we're better off when we surround ourselves with good people. And so I think that self awareness is important because, in the absence of it, we start to cover our asses a little bit. We start to make some logical leaps. But I think that just the ability to listen actively is so important in creating an environment where people can be their best selves. And I think it starts with leadership
Yeah.
being prepared to say, I'm here to listen because I couldn't possibly know all that's in your head right now. If I'm the VP of sales and you're a person who's out on the front lines selling product all day long, how could I possibly have what's in your head? I'm dying for exactly what's in your head because it'll make me better when I have to talk to all the people up here.
Hmm.
And so I think that's critical, just the sensibility to listen actively to people. And finally, I think just a service orientation. You serve your customer, and that begets growth and progress. But you turn around and you serve your team as well. And you make sure that your job one is knocking obstacles out of their way. That that gets so much more out of your people.
Hmm.
And not only does it make them more productive, it makes them easier to retain and easier to be happy and do their best work. And all that makes the leader look great. So I think those are really some of the ones that are top of mind.
With this idea of social enterprise and this idea of mission flywheel, I'm curious, how do you see, or how do you help organizations build that flywheel that enables growth, even though they have this mission focus as well?
So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the conversation. We look at this growing need to quantify everything we do in
Mhm.
business to justify what we
Yeah.
invest in. Those are table stakes. We can't change that. That's how everything works. However, we've also talked about how with social impact, there are very different types of metrics. And so an outcomes orientation, I think the healthcare industry does very well at this because they have gone to great lengths to identify patient outcomes as a business priority. And this is something that the rest of the world ought to, the rest of industry
Mhm.
ought to perk up and take notice. So to give you an example, in education, you could look at what institutions need to be doing. And you look at how they are measured and deemed to be effective. And what are they doing? They're attracting applicants, they're processing applicants, admitting people. To some degree, there's attrition, but they keep it low, there's retention, and ultimately, there is graduation. And I won't get too dogmatic about what's wrong with higher education, but it doesn't, the reason people signed up to be there is not explained by that graduation metric. So, what would outcomes be? Outcomes would be job placement. What kind of job? How quickly? How much is the starting salary, right? How much of those very substantial student loans am I going to start paying down now that I'm out? But going further, it's career shifts, promotions, looking at establishing oneself in an industry. Perhaps there's some element of continuing education and how qualified are we to then go into an MBA program or a JD or whatever it might be, and even career earnings or career satisfaction. These are all outcomes that speak to the root cause of a consumer ending up in the applicant funnel and ultimately choosing to attend a university. I went there not for the diploma, but I went there for the career.
Mhm.
And so I think that's the kind of thinking that we need to apply to any business. And that's how Mission Flywheel aims to support social enterprises to say, there are a lot of things you can do to measure your impact on the world. And they might not show up in the balance sheet. Your investors want to see ARR and they want to see your churn numbers low, and they've got all those metrics, EBITDA, all the great acronyms that we all know and love.
Mhm.
But what outcomes are you showing that prove you're true to your mission?
Mhm.
And that has nothing to do with profitability except in the most indirect way. And so I think that having learned so much in my years of marketing and sales, leading different teams, working with high profile clients, having learned all of that, there are just so many levers to pull that a CRO and the organization that they lead can say, look, we've got a lot of different tools at our disposal here in pursuit of those goals, in pursuit of those metrics that prove our social impact. And of course, along the way, we're also going to do it sustainably. We're going to do it while keeping costs in check, maximizing our margin, all the things the CFO wants from us as well. So it really is a marriage of the sort of purely capitalist goals with the pure social enterprise goals, and a merging of the two.
Thank you for that. I think we've covered a fair bit of ground, but in terms of integrating mission-driven strategies to not only enhance the company's social impact but drive predictable revenue growth, are there perhaps one or two areas that you find often gets glossed over or doesn't get much airtime? If so, what would they be?
Lots of things get glossed over, but that's also because there are so many unique angles to this type of work. But to give you an example, I think that one area that we often overlook is the sales funnel. And we all know what the sales funnel looks like. I think we all respect the importance of the sales funnel in a sales and marketing, in a smooth operation. But the reality is the kind of intelligence that governs our true understanding of the sales funnel really is quite profound and requires a lot of introspection, because the stages of a sale, especially as in B2B, and especially increasingly with complex technologies, these deals take longer and longer to close. There are more and more people weighing in on the decision. And there are many unique twists and turns throughout the process. So it could be very easy to wow a customer in a demo, and it could be equally difficult to actually get through a technical negotiation about what the product needs to do if this company is going to sign a multi-year contract. And I think that understanding what are the different stages in this dance that we're doing with clients, what aspects of the dialogue characterize that, who takes center stage on either side of the transaction at this particular point in time, what are the objections that happen, how do we handle and counter those objectives, and basically what can we do to make it go from, call it 2 months to 2 weeks,
Mhm.
to get through a specific stage and get on with the next one. So I think those are a lot of, it's very easy to put into words. It's much harder to put into practice, but it really is a soul searching exercise. And I find that whenever you take a microscope to your sales funnel, if you open your mind, you can learn some incredible things.
To wrap up, Paul, if you were listening to this episode, what would you say would be your top takeaway?
If I was listening to this episode that we're recording right now, what is my top takeaway? I think probably the sort of main takeaway that comes to mind, or that I hope comes to mind and is lasting for this audience, is that nowhere is it written that a business can't be wildly successful and profitable while also solving major social problems. And I think that we're going to start to see evidence of that more and more as good, solid, socially rooted business models start to take root, as smart entrepreneurs find the growing pot of funding that's available. They're going to prove to us that you can actually do both. You can, as people say, you can do good and you can do well at the same time.
Brilliant. And if listeners are curious, want to find out more or connect with you, where would you recommend they head to?
Yeah, I'm always happy to connect with people on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only person named Paul Burani on LinkedIn. I could be wrong. But otherwise, missionflywheel.com is our website. And between LinkedIn and the website, I think you've got what you need.
All right. Well, we'll include links to that in the show notes. Paul, thank you for sharing. It's been brilliant.
Thank you, Vinay. Appreciate it.
No